I'm Tim McMahon. I'm an associate professor of history at Marquette University.
How did you first become interested in the discipline of history?
That's a tough question. I was working for a few years between undergraduate and going back to graduate school, and I had been thinking I would study German history if I did go back. But I also got started on a family roots kick, and when my wife and I got married, we went to Ireland, which is my specialty is modern Irish and British Empire history. And I was reading a lot about Ireland. So she suggested we go to Ireland for our honeymoon. And while we were there, we found the house that my grandfather was born in. And this was a moment for me that was incredibly personal, but it also started to bring together a whole lot of what I had heard in terms of family stories about why they left and when they left, but also what I was reading about Ireland. It personalized it, it galvanized it. And those two moments really, for me, got me thinking, first of all, I really want to do this professionally. I want to learn more about it. And secondly, my focus was shifting to Ireland and Britain away from Germany. I was drawn to history partly, I mentioned earlier, because of my experiences in Germany and in Ireland. But I went to college in a small town in Virginia at a school that was named for George Washington and Robert E. Lee. So I was surrounded by American history, and that was something that I really appreciated. And I have a particular sort of a hobby interest, especially in the founding generation here in the U.S. So on the side, I'm reading books about American history, just as much as I'm reading stuff about modern Ireland and the British Empire. So my advice: get out and explore other parts of the world, and that doesn't just mean in the history department, where we have a superb faculty. I mean, I'm a great advocate for our department because we've got so many really talented people. But this university affords them the chance to study literature, philosophy, theology, the sciences, the social sciences, and when you start to think about the many offerings that can inform historical study, I think that's a great benefit. So, we require this in our Marquette Common Core, but I want them to think beyond the Common Core and think about how other disciplines inform their historical consciousness.
You mentioned the department briefly, and so what would you say sets Marquette's history department apart from other history departments?
We have such a range of specialties, from Jennifer Finn, who's an expert in the ancient world, the ancient regions in Western Asia. I mean, she's done work on Assyria, for instance, but also on the ancient Greeks, and Alexander the Great would be one of her particular areas of expertise, right on up to people who are studying, in depth American history, East Asia, and Dan Meisner studying China, Michael Wirt studying Japan, to Africa, both sub-Saharan Africa with Dr. Karia, or the Middle East and North Africa with Dr. Naylor. I mean, we have such an array of courses, and what's interesting to me is that our department has an incredible research profile, but we also are dedicated teachers. And I mean, I consider myself blessed to work with a department where we've won, frankly, more teaching awards than any other department by far on this campus. And that speaks to a tradition that we're proud of, and it speaks to the commitment that we have to bring our research into our classrooms and really energize our classrooms with cutting edge work. I want to make a distinction between the discipline of history and historical consciousness. So, I mean, I kind of think of developing a historical consciousness, especially for an undergraduate or just a general reader, by that they're not reading specialized history, works of history. So I think historical fiction is a great way in. One of the works that got me thinking about Ireland was a novel by a man named Thomas Flanagan called The Year of the French. And it's about the Society of the United Irishmen and relations with revolutionary France in the 1790s. It's beautifully crafted. It's informed by history. There are, real historical figures who are in there, but it's a fiction, right? But boy, did it make me start to want to learn more about the 1790s. And I think that kind of a book can be fantastic. The question of where people of color might see themselves in Irish history, I think, is a really important one. And it's one that we're just starting to grapple with, I think, in important ways. A colleague of mine at Middle Tennessee State, Mark Doyle, for instance, contributed a very impressive chapter to a book I co-edited a couple of years ago, looking at the question of where we might find people of color in Ireland. Throughout history. He focuses on the period from the late 18th century, the late 1700s, into the early 1900s. And this is a really important question, in part because, as I said earlier, the Irish were engaged in all parts of the world, but also because on both sides of the Atlantic, there is I think, a really dangerous misuse of history that one sees cropping up periodically on the internet, for example, that the Irish were slaves and we somehow managed to get beyond that, and therefore why do people of color who were enslaved not get beyond that? White nationalists, for instance, will espouse this sort of view. There is a very brief period of time in the mid 1600s where Irish young people in particular were sold as slaves. But the vast majority of the Irish who were brought into the Atlantic world, if you will, were brought out as indentured servants. They were not chattel slaves whose condition was a hereditary one, as with the slave trade more generally. But one of the things that you see in Irish history is that whether it is Irish people going out into empire and encountering people of color and engaging with people of color, perhaps intermarrying with people of color, is that because trade flowed in both directions, the people flowed in both directions. And so you have, whether it's Lascar sailors or black Africans or people from East Asia, China, and Japan who are visiting what would become the United Kingdom, some settling, but usually these were people who were visiting for periods of time. You also have a really interesting situation in Ireland, especially in the late 18th and early 19th century, where the abolition movement takes great hold, in part because many people in Ireland felt themselves to be, if not enslaved to the British state, at least at a significant disadvantage to the British state and to British agents within Ireland itself. And particularly Irish Quakers were outspoken on abolition, but the great nationalist and Catholic advocate Daniel O'Connell was a great advocate for abolition, both within the British Empire and then more broadly, and he even spoke out on Irish America. Famously, Frederick Douglass made about a 3.5-month trip to Ireland in the mid-1840s, and he wrote about that himself. And there's been a lot of attention lately to Douglass's visit. The book that I think more people have probably read than any others, and the one that I think helped to give me at least a little bit of a reputation among Irish scholars was Grand Opportunity, the Gaelic Revival in Irish Society, which looks at the Gaelic language revival and the formation of modern Irish identity. It's a social history that lays out the membership of the Gaelic League, which was the most prominent language revival group in Ireland, founded in 1893. it's a work that I continue to go back to and am continually examining the conclusions of and the research on. A lot more material has come out since that book came out in 2008, so I think at some point I'm going to go back and maybe do a second edition, new material. But that would probably be the one. There's a shorter book that might make for a quicker read, and that would be Padraig O'Fahy's War of Independence, Recollections of a Galway Gaelic Leaguer. And O'Fahy was a revolutionary and was also a Gaelic language teacher. And he wrote a short memoir that was never published, that was sitting in the National Library when I first saw it. And I was working on my dissertation at that point in time and trying to get as much information as I could about Gaelic language revivalists who were from, who weren't famous, if you will. They weren't famous revolutionaries. And O'Fahy gave me a really interesting window on that. And it just so happened that Cork University Press was doing a series called Irish Narratives where they were looking for just that kind of material. So I was able to edit that book.
Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.